moving on to our last topic, and this is drugs. Now, disclaimer, I'm not a drug expert, so I'm going to link to you a variety of videos of people who can explain this better than I can, but I'll try. So first off, definition of what this is. We call these psychoactive drugs in particular. These are drugs that actively alter your psyche, psychoactive. So these are drugs that are capable of altering your state of consciousness. Now, the way they work is by actually increasing or decreasing neurotransmitters in the brain. So for instance, if you've got, you're taking psychoactive drugs, they're going to kind of interfere in the synapse and either bind to receptors or kind of somehow increase or decrease chemical signaling in the brain. Now, there are several important principles and vocab words we're going to talk about before diving into the different drugs. So let's say that this is your baseline state. So if you take this amount of drug, it leads to this result. You're content, you're improved, you're at a certain state of happiness after this amount of drug. Now, there are two kind of outcomes that could happen from this. The first is called tolerance, which is when you need even more of a drug to get the same effect. So the same level of happiness now takes twice as many drugs, some arbitrary amount more of drug to get that effect. So you start to develop a tolerance for a drug is when you need more of it. Now, conversely, you might have withdrawal, which is when physical responses occur to the absence of a drug that you regularly use. So same amount of drug, if all of a sudden it's not available to you anymore, you decide to quit it, it leads to adverse consequences. So you lose your happiness and you have an adverse physical reaction. So think about tolerance and withdrawal in respect to some of the different drugs we'll talk about. One other though, whereas like tolerance and withdrawal are symptoms of this dependence on a drug, not all addictive drugs will have these features. So addiction is this compulsive physical or psychological even dependence on drugs or activities. So addiction can occur without symptoms of tolerance or withdrawal, and they occur despite knowing negative consequences of these outcomes, these behaviors. Now, addiction typically alters your decision-making. So people who have an addiction to a particular thing will tend to base their decisions on short-term outcomes. So for instance, the feeling that I'll get if I do this behavior, instead of the long-term outcomes. So how this might affect my family or my relationships, my finances, my job, things like that. So it alters their decision-making. But I want to be clear that even though we're going to talk about drugs moving forward, you can be addicted to a variety of things. So things like spending time on your phone, making a lot of money. However, where it crosses the line becoming an addiction is when it starts to really interfere with your personal life. So if it starts to interfere with your jobs, your relationships, when you start to make those short-term decisions versus those long-term outcomes, it crosses the line into being more of an addiction instead. Now, the way this works in the brain is based off like kind of three different alternative pathways. So the first kind of system that it might occur is through the impulsive or reward-seeking system. And this is involved in a bunch of dopamine kind of pathways and dopamine as a transmitter. So this is commonly in the nucleus accumbens. So again, pointing to around here, if you remember back from neuroscience, Nicholas, who is buying his Benz and is full of reward and pleasure, this is an area that's often associated with this reward-seeking type of behavior. So if there is an abnormal amount of dopamine or an abnormal just kind of deficit in this area, it might lead to addictive kind of behaviors. Secondly, there's a system called the reflective system, which is in your frontal lobe. It weighs a lot of your pros and cons, it makes decisions, it controls your impulses, complex decisions and actions that we've talked about your frontal lobe being involved in. So again, drugs that affect this area or behaviors that affect this area can again lead to addiction if you're not making, mature and thought out decisions. You might have a deficit in your frontal lobe. And then lastly here, this area of the brain called the insula, which I don't believe we've necessarily talked about yet, but it's kind of inside. That's why you see these little prongs that are pulling the brain apart. But it's a slightly internal piece of the cortex that's involved in a lot of cravings, feelings of disgust too, emotions, those kind of things. So maybe there's kind of an emotional aspect to addiction as well.